I don't know about you, but when I read my favourite books and they grab hold of me, I still think to myself, I'm never going to be able to do that. The thing is though, we can learn. And in this video, I want to show you 3 techniques that can help you write the kinds of stories that will grab your readers and make them forget they were supposed to be asleep 2 hours ago. To demonstrate, what I need first is a piece of writing that needs improvement. And like all writers, luckily, I'm not short on that. I'm currently editing my 8th novel, Project Ventus. I've just had a load of feedback on it, and within that feedback, my wife handily pointed out an exact passage in my book where I am really not grabbing the reader. So now I've got an opportunity to turn this into this. So let's take a quick look at this short moment from my book, and while I'm reading it, see what you think needs to change. Then we'll talk through 3 techniques I think we can use to make the writing a bit more attention grabbing. So for context, my character's just arrived at this remote research base, so here's the passage. The air was clear and there was a cool breeze. The excitement really came back to Kieren then. A quiet anticipation for what the station had in store for her, and for being left alone to look around the island in her downtime, however much or little that turned out to be. Okay, so aside from the second half being a fragment sentence and not making any sense, the rest of it isn't throw the book away terrible. It's just kind of surface level, and I think it's pretty boring. That first sentence is the product of me typing rather than writing, and I think we've got an opportunity to make changes now that will grab a reader instead of losing them. And for a bit more context, this scene takes place on the side of a mountain on a tropical island in Thailand. So I really don't think the air would be cool and clear. It would probably be warm and humid, if anything. So the simplest thing we could do to make that first sentence better is just to update it so that it's actually correct. The air was humid and there was a warm breeze. That's fine, but it's still not going to keep a reader interested, so we need to go further. The real issue here is that it's just flat telling. Here are the facts. This line has no life in it, and that life is what you need to add in if you want to keep a reader's attention, so let's try it. We're writing about the wind and the air, and my character has just arrived at this remote research base. She's trying to find herself, so how about something like this instead? A breath of humid air crossed Karina's face. Firstly, I've involved my character, so that brings a little bit more life to the line straight away, and secondly, I've used the word breath to suggest a feeling of warmth to my reader, rather than just telling them the breeze is warm. That's the first tip. Lead readers to imagine. Don't try to see the story for them. If we're not careful when we write a story, we can find ourselves giving instructions to the reader, rather than letting them imagine the story for themselves. This version of the sentence is better than before because it allows space for them to imagine. Allowing readers to imagine things as they naturally want them will hold their attention more. And I think we can add even more life to this line with my next tip. So instead of ending the sentence there as it originally was, I'm going to use a comma and connect it to the next part. The part that currently reads like this. The excitement really came back to Kieren then. We've already covered that. I'm just telling the reader how Kieren feels here. I'm not leading them to imagine anything. So as a result of that, they're probably not feeling much or empathizing. That's because I've just used the word for the emotion rather than creating or describing the feeling of it. This is a tricky pitfall for writers, because it would seem that naturally, if there's a word for something, that's probably the word that you should use, but it doesn't always work that way in reality. That can be great for clarity, but in my opinion, it's not great for immersion and feeling and what grabs readers, which is making them feel something. To improve this, we need to replace that obvious word excitement with something else. We need to create an impression of that feeling that we can use instead to help keep readers interested. To me, in this moment, Kieren is feeling adventurous, but nervous, unsure, curious. She's in a new place, on the cusp of new experiences, and I want to capture as much of that as I can in that moment. So instead of the excitement really came back to Kieren then, how about this? A breath of humid air crossed Karina's face, and for a moment she felt like a child again, somewhere far off and bright that she couldn't quite place. To me, this brings in the adventure of new experiences. It brings the nerves and anticipation. It feels a bit like nostalgia or that feeling of childhood adventure. And because of that, I think there's more to empathise with, because readers will have experienced a feeling like that. And yeah, maybe the feeling that I ended up creating here isn't exactly equal to excitement, but I don't think that really matters. What matters is creating a feeling. That, to me, will retain a reader's interest way more than just telling them the character was excited. Emotions are impossible to describe, really, in the same way that colours are, but the way to get close to it is by suggesting things that will help to build a feeling of that emotion. Memories, senses, images, dreams, sensations, anything can work for this. We've improved this passage a fair bit now by using 2 out of the 3 tips I want to show you, but we still need to use 1 more, and then I want to see what you think of how the whole thing turns out. So let's move on to the last sentence, where we can use our 3rd tip, which is my favourite one, to make more improvements. Here's what we already have. A quiet anticipation for what the station had in store for her, and for being left alone to look around the island in her downtime, however much or little that turned out to be. You might have noticed the first problem to overcome there, as I mentioned. That's not a full sentence, it's subjectless. And again, we could start making improvements by just correcting that and making it grammatically correct. She felt a quiet anticipation for what the station had in store for her, and for being left alone to look around. So it's grammatically correct now, but it's even longer and it's still not grabbing a reader. I think to grab a reader's attention here, we actually need to say less. We've already talked about how Karina feels in our last sentence, so the bit about quiet anticipation, I don't think we even need that. We only need to keep the part about being left alone on the island and wondering how much recreation time she might have. And once again, as it stands, I'm just telling the readers with this boring, static image how Karina is feeling or what she's thinking about. To keep their attention and engage their imagination a little bit, let's try pulling them a bit closer and making this static, boring picture move. We do that by allowing the reader access to Karina's imagination by giving them a few specific details. How about something like this? She saw herself hiking here on her off days, photographing picturesque waterfalls or standing on the island's peaks, watching the glint of cars catching the sun far over on the mainland. This, again, I think is better because it has a little movement, and it also gives the reader something specific to picture in their mind's eye, instead of trying to make them imagine a kind of shapeless, vague concept like looking around the island. That's my 3rd tip and my favourite one. Imagine the sentences you write as images that will be projected into your reader's mind. Giving readers more to think about, not with 100 details, but with a little bit of movement and the chance to use their own imagination, I think is what keeps them engaged. I want to know what you think of this whole passage in its new format, so let's recap the before and after version before I give you those final 3 tips again to take away. And once we've heard it, let me know what you think in the comments below. So here's what we originally had when I was just typing rather than writing, really. The air was clear and there was a cool breeze. The excitement really came back to Karina then. A quiet anticipation for what the station had in store for her, and for being left alone to look around the island in her downtime, however much or little that turned out to be. And here's what that turned into. A breath of humid air crossed Karina's face, and for a moment she felt like a child again, somewhere far off and bright that she couldn't quite place. She saw herself hiking here on her off days, photographing picturesque waterfalls, or standing on the island's peaks, watching the glint of cars catching the sun far over on the mainland. The great thing about writing is that it's subjective. You might not like my style of writing at all, but I still think it's clear, even without the rest of the context from the story, how much difference these 3 tips can make. Lead readers to imagine, don't try to see the story for them. Of course it's your story, but it's for readers. Suggest the details and let your reader find them. Don't just say the breeze was warm, refer to it as a breath. Create the feeling of an emotion rather than simply naming it. Don't just use the word excitement, create the feeling of it by drawing on things from the life of your character or the world of your story. Think of sentences as images. Each sentence you write has the power to create an image in your reader's mind. Give those images clarity and movement, and they'll be more engaging. Each of those tips I think is a great way to grab readers and keep them turning pages. But of course there's nothing like a cohesive and logical plot to make a book into a real page turner. If you want to hear the amazingly simple tip that changed how I looked at plotting stories forever, here's my video about that. Thank you so much for watching as always, and happy writing.